You're watching the Everything Network. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, born March 12, 1945, is an American former mobster who became underboss of the Gambino crime family. As the underboss, Gravano played a major role in prosecuting John Gotti, the crime family's boss, by agreeing to testify as a government witness against him and other mobsters in a deal in which he confessed to involvement in 19 murders. Originally an associate for the Colombo crime family and later for the Brooklyn faction of the Gambino family, Gravano was part of the group that conspired to murder Gambino boss Paul Castellano in 1985. He played a key role in planning and executing Castellano's murder, along with John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, Frank DeCicco, and Joseph Armone. Soon after Castellano's murder, Gotti elevated Gravano to become an official captain after Salvatore Todo Aurelio stepped down, a position he held until 1987 when he became consigliere. In 1988, he became underboss, a position he held at the time he became a government witness. In 1991, Gravano agreed to turn state's evidence and testify for the prosecution against Gotti after hearing the boss making several disparaging and untrue remarks about Gravano on a wiretap that implicated them both in several murders. At the time, he was the highest-ranking member of the five families to break his blood oath and cooperate with the government. As a result of his testimonies, Gotti and Frank Locascio were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in 1992. In 1994, a federal judge sentenced Gravano to 5 years in prison. However, since Gravano had already served 4 years, the sentence amounted to less than 1 year. He was released early and entered the United States Federal Witness Protection Program in Colorado, but left the program in 1995 after 8 months and went to Arizona with family. In 1997, Gravano was consulted several times for the biographical book about his life, Underboss by author Peter Maas. In February 2000, Gravano and nearly 40 other ring members, including his ex-wife Deborah, daughter Karen and son Gerard, were arrested on federal and state drug charges. In 2001, Gravano and his son, Gerard, were indicted on mirror charges with the federal government. In 2002, he was sentenced in New York to 20 years in prison. A month later, he was also sentenced in Arizona to 19 years in prison to run concurrently. Additionally, Sammy was sentenced to lifetime supervised release and a $100,000 fine. He was released in September 2017. Sammy Gravano was born on March 12, 1945, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Both of Gravano's parents hailed from Sicily. Sammy's mother, born in 1906, arrived in the United States as a young girl from Puglia, Italy, while his father, Giorlando, born in 1901, arrived in the US after jumping ship in Canada and with help from his older brother Alfonso Gravano, was smuggled into the US illegally. Alfonso was already an established bootlegger and made member of the Sicilian mafia. During Prohibition, Alfonso was a successful bootlegger and transported booze into the US on both northeast and northwest coasts. As part of the Sunset Fleet, Alfonso ran booze through the Hudson River and other New York waterways. His booze made its way into the city to the Fulton Fish Market and then sold to the NY speakeasies. On the West Coast, his operation ran the booze from Canada to Oregon, near the Bull River. Jerry worked as a skilled fisherman in Sicily. In the US, he became a painter, working on houses and buildings, as New York grew at a staggering rate. Later, Gravano's parents ran a small dress factory, his mother being a talented seamstress. They maintained a good standard of living for the family. At age 13, he joined the Rampers, a prominent street gang in Bensonhurst. He had found that some older children had stolen his bicycle and went to fight the thieves. Made men who were watching from a cafe saw him take on a few of the older boys at once, and they gave Gravano back his bike. As he was leaving, one of the made men remarked on how little Sammy fought like a bull Gravano had dyslexia, was bullied, and did poorly in school. Teachers classified him as being a slow learner. He was held back from grade advancement on 2 occasions, the 4th and 7th grades, and also punched school officials on 2 occasions. Gravano was eventually sent to a school for incorrigibles, 600 school. However, just before he reached the age of 16, the school refused to keep him any longer, and his parents signed him out of school. Gravano's father tried to redirect and discipline his son, including forcing him to attend mass, but had little success. In 1964, Gravano was drafted into the United States Army and served in Fort Jackson, South Carolina. While an enlisted man, Gravano mainly worked as a mess hall cook. He rose to the rank of corporal and was granted an honorable discharge after 2 years. In 1971, Gravano married Deborah Sabetta. They had 2 children. His daughter Karen Gravano appeared on the reality series Mob Wives beginning in 2011 and released a book in 2013 titled Mob Daughter, The Mafia, Sammy the Bull Gravano, and Me. Later in his mob career, he was ordered to help arrange the murder of his brother-in-law, Nicholas Sabetta. Gravano is also the brother-in-law of Gambino soldier Eddie Garofalo. He was a childhood friend of Colombo crime family associate Gerard Papa, who was also the leader of the Rampers. The Mafia had a long-standing presence in Bensonhurst via the Profasi family, which evolved into the Colombo family. Despite his father's attempts to dissuade him, Gravano, like many of his Rampa colleagues, drifted into the Cosa Nostra. He first became associated with the Cosa Nostra in 1968 through his friend Tommy Sparrow, whose uncle Shorty, also named Tommy. Sparrow was an associate of the Colombo family under future boss Carmine Persico. Gravano was initially involved in crimes such as larceny, hijacking, and armed robbery. He quickly moved into racketeering, loan sharking, and running a lucrative poker game in the back room of an after-hours club, of which he was part owner. Gravano became a particular favorite of family boss Carmine Persico, who used Gravano to picket the FBI Manhattan headquarters as part of Joe Colombo Italian-American Civil Rights League initiative. Gravano's rise was so sudden that it was generally understood that he would be among the first to become made when the membership books were reopened. They had been closed since 1957. In 1970, Gravano committed his first murder. That of Joseph Colucci, a fellow Sparrow associate, with whose wife Tommy Sparrow was having an affair. The Colucci murder won respect and approval from Persico for Gravano. Later in life, Gravano became a mentor to Colucci's son Jack, who became involved in the construction industry as a Gambino associate. In the early 1970s, Colombo soldier Ralph Sparrow, brother of Shorty, became envious of Gravano's success, fearing that he would become a made man before his son, Tommy. This rivalry culminated with the death of Ralph Ronga, another Colombo family soldier in Ralph Sparrow's crew. After Ronga's death, a rumor had spread that Gravano had attempted to pick up Ronga's widow, Sybil Davies, at a bar, though Gravano maintained that Davies was the one hitting on him. Ralph Sparrow used this rumor in an attempt to gain support to have Gravano killed, or as an excuse to kill Gravano himself. While Shorty Sparrow believed Gravano rather than Ralph, he and the Colombo hierarchy decided that to avoid conflict, it was best for Gravano to be transferred to the Gambino crime family. Now with the Gambinos, Gravano became an associate of Capo Salvatore Todo Orello. Orello quickly took a liking to Gravano and became his mob mentor. Around this time, Gravano took a construction job. He later claimed to have considered leaving the criminal life. A former associate, however, falsely claimed to the New York District Attorney's Office that Gravano and another associate were responsible for a double murder of the Dunn brothers from 1969. After Gravano was indicted, he desperately needed money to pay his legal bills. He quit his construction job and went on a self-described robbing rampage for a year and a half alongside his goombata Alexander Alleyboy Cuomo. A couple weeks into the trial, Gravano's lawyers moved to dismiss the charges due to the witness being declared legally insane. Gravano later said of this legal problem, "That arrest changed my whole life. I never ever stopped a second from there on in. I was like a madman. Never stopped stealing. Never stopped robbing. I was obsessed." Gravano's robbery spree impressed Aurelio, who proposed him for membership in the Gambino family soon after the membership books were reopened. In 1976, Gravano was formally initiated into the Gambino family as a made man, along with Todo's son, Charlie Boy Aurelio. Sammy and Charlie Boy had been friends since they were kids. In 1978, boss Paul Castellano allegedly ordered the murder of Gambino associate Nicholas Scobbetta. A cocaine and alcohol user, Scobbetta participated in several public fights and insulted the daughter of George DeCicco. Since Scobbetta was Gravano's brother-in-law, Castellano asked Frank DeCicco to first notify Gravano of the impending hit. When advised of Scobbetta's fate, Gravano was furious. However, Gravano was eventually calmed by DeCicco and accepted Scobbetta's death as the punishment earned by his behavior. Gravano later said, "I chose against Nicky. I took an oath that the mafia came before everything." Scobbetta was dismembered and his body was never found, other than a hand. Sammy later opened an after-hours club in Bensonhurst called the Bus Stop. The bar was the scene of a violent altercation one night, involving a rowdy biker gang intent on ransacking the establishment. A melee ensued, in which Gravano broke his ankle and the bikers were chased off. Gravano then went to Castellano and received permission to kill them all. Along with Laborio Louis Melito, Gravano hunted down the leader, injuring him and killing another member of the gang. Castellano was flabbergasted when he learned that Gravano personally took part in the hit. Like his predecessor Carlo Gambino, Castellano favored emphasizing more sophisticated schemes involving construction, trucking, and garbage disposal over traditional street-level activities such as loan sharking, gambling, and hijackings. Big Paul had a particular interest in the construction business. Sammy entered into the plumbing and drywall business with his brother-in-law, Edward Garofalo. Gravano's construction and other business interests soon earned him a reputation as a big earner within the Gambino organization and made him a multi-millionaire, enabling him to build a large estate for his family in rural Cream Ridge, New Jersey. He invested in trotting horses to race at the Meadowlands racetrack in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Sammy became the operator of a popular discotheque, the Plaza Suite, in the Gravesend section of Brooklyn. He reportedly made $4,000 a week from the Plaza Suite. The Bull owned the building and used the bottom level as his business headquarters. He further proved himself to the boss when he interceded in a civil war that had erupted within the Philadelphia crime family. In March 1980, longtime Philadelphia boss Angelo Bruno was assassinated by his consigliere, Antonio Caponigro, and his brother-in-law, Anthony Salerno, without authorization from the commission. Caponigro, a Chicago native, operated in the iron-bound neighborhood of Newark, New Jersey. As a made member of the Philadelphia crime family in the 1950s and 1960s, he became a recognized crime figure after being identified by mob turncoat Joseph Valahi in 1963. During that time, he served under Captain Riccardo Biondi. He was the son of a wealthy banana merchant who owned and managed a stand at the Italian market, otherwise known as the South 9th Street Curb Market. He rose in rank to become the consigliere during the 1970s. He foresaw the end of the peaceful Angelo Bruno regime and decided to hasten it. Indictments for racketeering were being brought against the ailing Bruno, and there was no leadership in the methamphetamine industry. Caponigro knew that he could count on the support of several key members of Bruno's administration after the Don died. Accordingly, Caponigro traveled to New York City to consult his friend Frank Thierry from the Genovese crime family. Caponigro controlled a lucrative numbers operation in Newark, New Jersey. a holdover from the 1960s when the New York families had ceded parts of North Jersey to the Philadelphia crime family. Trucchio also had activities in the area, and he had challenged Caponegro's incursion. He appealed the territorial dispute to the commission, which, acting on Bruno's recommendation, ruled in favor of him. Caponegro approached Trucchio with a plan to murder Bruno and take over the Philadelphia crime family. Trucchio assured him that he would support him before the commission. He returned to Philadelphia, believing that his planned coup was now officially sanctioned. He recruited the support of his brother-in-law, Alfred Salerno, not related to mob turncoat Joseph Salerno or mob front boss Anthony Salerno, and Bruno regime capos John Simone and Frank Sindone, and ordered the assassination. The commission summoned Caponegro to New York, where it sentenced him to death for his transgression. After he was tortured and killed, Philip Testa was installed as the new Philadelphia boss and Nicky Scarfo as consigliere. The commission subsequently placed contracts on Caponegro's co-conspirators, including Johnny Keys Simone, who also happened to be Bruno's cousin. The Simone contract was given to Gravano. After befriending Simone through a series of meetings, Gravano, with the assistance of Melito and D'Angelo, abducted Simone from Yardley Golf Club in Yardley, Pennsylvania, part of suburban Trenton, New Jersey, and drove him to a wooded area on Staten Island. Gravano then granted Simone's requests to die with his shoes off, in fulfillment of a promise he had made to his wife, and at the hands of a made man. After he removed Simone's shoes, Melito shot Simone in the back of the head, killing him. Sammy later expressed admiration for Simone as a so-called man's man, remarking favorably on the calmness with which he accepted his fate. By the early 1980s, the Plaza Suite was a thriving establishment. Patrons often had to wait an hour to get in, and the club featured high-profile live acts such as singer Chubby Checker. In 1982, Frank Fiala, a wealthy businessman and drug trafficker, paid $40,000 to rent the Plaza Suite for a birthday party he was throwing himself. 2 days after the party, Gravano accepted a $1 million offer from Fiala to buy the establishment, which was much higher than the property value. The deal was structured to include $50,000 cash as a down payment, $650,000 in gold bullion under the table, and a $300,000 payment at the real estate closing. Before the transaction was completed, Fiala began acting like he already owned the club. Later, after leaving the Plaza Suite, Gravano called Garofalo and set up an ambush outside the club, involving Garofalo, Melito, D'Angelo, Nicholas Mormando, Michael DeBatt, Thomas Carbonara, and Johnny Holmes in the plan. Later that same night, Gravano confronted Fiala on the street as he exited the Plaza Suite among a group of people, asking, "Hey Frank, how you doing?" As Fiala turned around, surprised to see Gravano, Melito came up behind him and shot him in the head. Melito stood over the body and fired a shot into each of Fiala's eyes, as Fiala's entourage and the crowd of people on the street dispersed, screaming. Gravano walked up to Fiala's body and spat on him. Gravano was never charged for the crime. He had made a $5,000 payoff to the later discredited and disgraced New York Police Department homicide detective Luis Eppolito to ensure the investigation yielded no leads. Although Sammy evaded criminal charges, he incurred Castellano's wrath over the unsanctioned killing. Gravano attempted to lie low for nearly 3 weeks afterwards, during which time he called his crew together and made the decision to kill Castellano if necessary. Sammy and Melito were then summoned to a meeting with Castellano at a Manhattan restaurant. Big Paul had been given the details of what Fiala had done, but he was still livid that Sammy had not come to him for permission to kill Fiala first. Gravano was spared execution when he convinced Castellano that the reason he had kept him in the dark was to protect the boss in case something went wrong with the hit. Fiala's murder posed one final problem for the Bull in the form of the Internal Revenue Service. The high publicity generated by the incident triggered an tax investigation into Gravano and Fiala's deal for the sale of the Plaza Suite, and Gravano was subsequently charged with tax evasion. Gravano was represented by Gerald Shargle and acquitted at trial. D'Angelo was later killed by a Colombo family associate celebrating his having been proposed for membership. The killer was then murdered himself on orders from the Colombo family. In the aftermath of the Fiala murder, Gravano continued to focus on his construction business, branching out into the lucrative drywall industry. New York City's cement industry was controlled by 4 out of the 5 families, which made millions of dollars by manipulating bids and steering contracts. Gravano said in 1998, "I literally controlled Manhattan. Literally. You want concrete poured in Manhattan? That was me. Tishman, Donald Trump, all these guys. They couldn't build a building without me." He eventually became embroiled in a dispute with business partner Louis De Bono, a member of another Gambino crew. Gravano and his brother-in-law Eddie had a meeting with De Bono, along with an attorney and an accountant De Bono brought, at which De Bono said only $50,000 was due. Sammy excused the attorney and accountant, and once alone with De Bono, banged him around the room because of the scam. Putting hands on another made man is a death penalty in Cosa Nostra. De Bono told his captain, Patsy Conti. Conti then told Castellano, and a sit-down was called. Toto spoke on Sammy and Gambino underboss Neil Delacroce intervened on Gravano's behalf, and Castellano told De Bono to pay him $200,000 and the two men end their business partnership. Gravano's standing with his boss slipped as a result of the incident. Delacroce, however, was rising star John Gotti's mentor. And when word got back to him that Delacroce had supported Gravano, Gotti and other Gambino members were impressed. During this time, the FBI had intensified its efforts against the Gambino family, and in August 1983, 3 members of Gotti's crew, Angelo Ruggiero, John Carneglia, and Gene Gotti, were indicted for heroin trafficking. Castellano was against anyone in the family dealing narcotics. Castellano planned to kill Gene Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero if he believed they were drug traffickers. Castellano asked Ruggiero for a copy of the government surveillance tapes that had Ruggiero's conversations. To save the crew members, Neil stalled the demand. Eventually, one of the reasons for Gotti's killing Castellano was to save himself, his brother, and Angelo. The tapes not only had them talking about drugs, but also the bosses and commission. The FBI had bugged Ruggiero's house and telephone, and Castellano decided he needed copies of the tapes to justify his impending move to Neil's and the family's other captains. When Castellano was indicted for both his connection to Roy DeMeo's stolen car ring and as part of the Mafia Commission trial, he learned his own house had been bugged on the basis of evidence from the Ruggiero tapes, and he became livid. In June 1985, he again demanded that Neil get him the tapes. Della tried to convince Gotti and Ruggiero to comply if Castellano explained beforehand how he intended to use the tapes, but Ruggiero refused, fearing he would endanger good friends. Prior to Castellano's indictment, Sammy was approached by Robert DiBernardo, a fellow Gambino member acting as an intermediary for Gotti. He informed him that Gotti and Ruggiero wanted to meet with him in Queens. The bull arrived to find only Ruggiero was present. Ruggiero informed Sammy that he and Gotti were planning to murder Castellano and asked for the bull's support. He was initially non-committal, wanting to confer first with Frank DeCicco. In conversation with DeCicco, both men voiced concern that Castellano would designate his nephew, Thomas Gambino, acting boss, and his driver, Thomas Bellotti, underboss in the event he was convicted and sent to prison. Neither man appealed to Gravano or DeCicco as leadership material, and they ultimately decided to support the hit on Castellano. Gravano's first choice to become boss after Castellano's murder was Frank DeCicco, but DeCicco felt John Gotti's ego was too big to take a subservient role. Frankie argued that Gotti's boldness intelligence, and charisma made him well suited to be a good boss, and he convinced Gravano to give Gotti a chance. Frankie and Sammy made a secret pact to kill the new Gambino boss and take over the family as boss and underboss, respectively, if they were unhappy with John Gotti's leadership after 1 year. The conspirators' first order of business was meeting with other Gambino members, most of whom were disaffected under Castellano, and gaining their support for the hit. They also recruited longtime capo Joseph Piney Armone into the conspiracy. Armone's support was critical. He was a respected old-timer in the family, and it was believed he could help win over Castellano supporters to the new regime. The next step was smoothing over the planned hit with the other families. It has long been a hard and fast rule in the mafia that killing a boss is forbidden without the support of a majority of the commission. Indeed, Gotti's planned hit would have been the first off-the-record hit on a boss since Frank Costello was nearly killed in 1957. Knowing it would be too risky to approach the other 4 bosses directly, the conspirators got the support of several important mobsters of their generation in the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. Gotti and Ruggiero then sought and obtained the approval of key figures from the Colombos and Bonannos, while De Chico secured the backing of top mobsters aligned with the Luccheses. They did not even consider approaching the Genoveses. Castellano had especially close ties with Genovese boss Vincent Chin Gigante, and approaching any major Genovese figure, even one of their generation, could have been. Gotti thus claimed he had the support of off-the-record contacts from 3 out of 5 families. With Neil Della Croce's death on December 2, 1985, the final constraint on a move by Gotti or Castellano against the other was removed. Gotti, enraged that Castellano chose not to attend his mentor's wake, wasted little time in striking. Not suspecting the plot against him, Castellano invited De Chico to a meeting on December 16, 1985, with fellow capos Thomas Gambino, James Failla, Johnny Gamarana, and Danny Marino at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. The conspirators considered the restaurant a prime location for the hit because the area would be packed with bustling crowds of holiday shoppers, making it easier for the assassins to blend in and escape. The plans for the assassination were finalized on December 15th, and the next afternoon, the conspirators met for a final time on the Lower East Side. At Gotti's suggestion, the shooters wore long white trench coats and black fur Russian hats, which Sammy considered a brilliant idea. Gotti and Sammy the Bull arrived at the restaurant shortly before 5 o'clock, and after circling the block, parked their car across the intersection and within view of the entrance. Around 5:30, Sammy spotted Castellano's Lincoln Town car stopped at a nearby intersection and, by walkie-talkie, alerted the team of hitmen stationed outside the restaurant of Big Pool's approach. Castellano's driver, Thomas Bellotti, pulled the car up directly in front of the entrance. As Castellano and Bellotti exited the Lincoln, they were ambushed and killed in a barrage of bullets. As the hat and trench coat-adorned men slipped away into the night, Gotti calmly drove the car past the front of the restaurant to get a look at the scene. Looking down at Bellotti's body from the passenger window, Gravano remarked, "He's gone." After Castellano's death, Gallo, the only surviving member of the hierarchy, convened a 3-man committee to temporarily run the family, comprising himself, Gotti, and Frankie De Chico. However, it was an open secret that Gotti was acting boss in all but name, and nearly all of the family's captains knew he had been the one behind the hit. Gotti was formally acclaimed as the new boss of the Gambino family at a meeting of 20 captains held on January 15, 1986. Gotti, in turn, selected De Chico as his underboss and elevated Sammy to captain after Toto Arello announced his desire to step down. On April 13, 1986, Frankie was killed when his car was bombed following a visit to Castellano loyalist James Fiala. The bombing was carried out by Victor Amuso and Anthony Casso of the Lucchese family, under orders of Vincent Gigante and Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo, to avenge Castellano and Bellotti by killing their successors. Gotti also planned to visit Failla that day, but cancelled. The bomb was detonated after a soldier, Frankie Hartz, asked DeCicco for a lawyer's business card. When he went to his car to retrieve the card, and when he sat in the passenger seat, the bomb exploded. Bombs had long been banned by the mafia out of concern that it would put innocent people in harm's way, leading the Gambinos to initially suspect that Zips, Sicilian mafiosi working in the US, were behind it. Zips were well known for using bombs. The first person on Gravano's hit list after Castellano's murder was Nicholas "Nicky Cowboy" Mormando, a former member of his crew. Mormando had become addicted to crack cocaine and was suspected by Gravano of getting friend and fellow crew member Michael DeBatt addicted to the drug. Gravano decided, because of Nicky's reckless behavior, including getting DeBatt addicted to crack, he would get permission from Gotti to kill Mormando. Gravano arranged to have Mormando murdered on his way to a meeting at Gravano's Bensonhurst restaurant, Tali's. After assuring Mormando of his safety, Gravano told him to pick up Joseph Peruta on his way. Peruta got in the back seat of the car and shot Mormando twice in the back of the head. Mormando's corpse was then disposed of in a vacant lot, where it was discovered the next day. Gotti was imprisoned in May 1986 at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, New York, while awaiting trial on RICO charges. He relied heavily on Gravano, Angelo Ruggiero, and Joseph "Piney" Armone to manage the family's day-to-day affairs, while he called the major shots from his jail cell. In June, Gravano was approached by Ruggiero and, supposedly at Gotti's behest, given orders to murder Capo Robert DiBernardo for making negative remarks about Gotti's leadership. Gravano was friendly with DiBernardo and tried to get the murder called off until he had a chance to speak with Gotti after his trial. The Bull met with Joseph Piney, where Piney explained Gotti wanted DB dead. Ruggiero claimed to have met again with Gotti and told Gravano that the boss wanted DiBernardo killed right away. Gravano arranged a meeting with the captain, where Joe Peruta, a member of Gravano's crew, shot DB twice in the back of the head as he watched. Sammy later learned that Ruggiero was $250,000 in debt to DiBernardo, and realized Ruggiero may have fabricated the orders from Gotti, or simply lied to Gotti about what DB was accused of saying, in order to erase the debt and improve his own standing in the family. In any event, DB's death proved profitable for Gravano, as he took over the deceased man's control of Teamsters Local 282. Gotti's trial ultimately ended in a mistrial due to a hung jury, and the boss was freed from jail. Sammy's specific position within the family varied during 1986 and 1987. With Gotti's permission, Sammy set up several murders with other Gambino associates. In 1986, Gotti underwent a racketeering trial. Jury selection for the racketeering case began again in August 1986, with Gotti standing trial alongside Gene "Willie Boy" Johnson, who, despite being exposed as an informant, refused to turn state's evidence, Leonard DeMaria, Tony Rampino, Nicholas Carozzo, and John Carneglia. At this point, the Gambinos were able to compromise the case when George Pape hid his friendship with Boško Radonjic and was impaneled as juror number 11. Through Radonjic, Pape contacted Gravano and agreed to sell his vote on the jury for $60,000. On March 13, 1987, they acquitted Gotti and his co-defendants of all charges. In the face of previous mafia convictions, particularly the success of the Mafia Commission trial, Gotti's acquittal was a major upset that further added to his reputation. The American media dubbed Gotti the Teflon Don in reference to the failure of any charges to stick. With DeCicco dead, the Gambinos were left without an underboss. Gotti chose to fill the vacancy with Joseph Armone. In 1987, Joseph N. Gallo was replaced with Gravano as consigliere, and by 1990, Gravano was promoted to underboss to replace the acting underboss Frank Locascio. By this time, Gravano was regarded as a rising force in the construction industry and often mingled with executives from major construction firms and union officials at his popular Bensonhurst restaurant, Tali's. Gravano's success was not without a downside. First, his quick rise up the Gambino hierarchy attracted the attention of the FBI, and he was soon placed under surveillance. Second, he started to sense some jealousy from Gotti over the profitability of his legitimate business interests. Nevertheless, Gravano claimed to be kicking up over $2 million each year to Gotti out of his union activities alone. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti, against Gravano's advice, required his capos to meet with him at the Ravenite Social Club once a week. The three were often recorded by the bugs placed throughout the Ravenite, concealed in the main room, the first-floor hallway, and the upstairs apartment of the building, discussing incriminating events. On December 11, 1990, FBI agents and NYPD detectives raided the Ravenite, arresting Gravano, Gotti, and Locascio. Gravano pleaded guilty to a superseding racketeering charge, and Gotti was charged with 5 murders: Castellano, Bellotti, Di Bernardo, Liborio Milito, and Luis Di Bono, conspiracy to murder, Gaetano Vastola, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, bribery, and tax evasion. Based on tapes from FBI bugs played at pretrial hearings, the Gambino administration was denied bail. At the same time, attorneys Bruce Cutler and Gerald Shargel were disqualified from defending Gotti and Gravano after prosecutors successfully contended they were part of the evidence and thus liable to be called as witnesses. Prosecutors argued that Cutler and Shargel not only knew about potential criminal activity, but had worked as in-house counsel for the Gambino family. Gotti subsequently hired Albert Krieger, a Miami attorney who had worked with Joseph Bonanno, to replace Cutler. The tapes also created a rift between Gotti and Sammy, as they contained recordings of the Gambino boss describing his newly appointed underboss as too greedy, and included discussions of Gotti's intent to frame the bull as the main force behind the murders of Di Bernardo, Milito, and De Bono. Gotti's attempt at reconciliation with Gravano failed, leaving Gravano disillusioned with the mob and doubtful on his chances of winning his case without Shargel, his former attorney. Gravano ultimately opted to turn state's evidence, formally agreeing to testify on November 13, 1991. He was the first member of the hierarchy of a New York crime family to turn informer, and the second confessed underboss in the history of the American mafia to do so after the Philadelphia crime family's Phil Leonetti
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
James "Jimmy" Brown Fiala was a high-ranking captain with the Gambino crime family and a major power in the garbage hauling industry in New York City. His crew was based in Brooklyn, with operations stretching into Staten Island, Manhattan, and New Jersey. He was raised in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, a neighborhood dominated by New York's La Cosa Nostra families. He eventually relocated to a modest home on Staten Island. In 1951, Fiala was convicted of bookmaking and illegal gambling charges and paid a $25 fine. During the 1950s, Jimmy became close to Carlo Gambino, underboss to Albert Anastasia, boss of what would become the Gambino crime family. He later served as Gambino's chauffeur bodyguard. After the 1957 murder of Anastasia, the new boss, Carlo Gambino, appointed Fiala as his point man in the waste hauling industry. In 1966, Fiala was again fined for bookmaking and illegal gambling. In 1970, he was charged with contempt of court for refusing to testify before a grand jury, but the charge was later dropped. By 1971, he had become a captain in the Gambino family. He was one of the most respected and feared racketeers in New York, and one of the all-time top earners. A resident of Ocean Breeze, Staten Island, his nickname Jimmy Brown derived from his fondness for brown clothes. Despite his power and wealth, Jimmy lived modestly. Law enforcement agents characterized him as being extremely cautious and constantly wary of electronic surveillance. He had a reputation as being one of the most discreet mobsters. During 1983, when the FBI was bugging the home of Gambino boss Paul Castellano, Fiala was present for hundreds of hours of meetings. During that 6-month period, Fiala barely spoke 10 words on all the tapes combined. To avoid electronic surveillance, he did not have a landline telephone in his social club in Bensonhurst. He did hang a poster on the wall showing a cockroach wearing a headset with the caption, "Our bugs have ears." Fiala's cautious habits allowed him to avoid criminal prosecution for many years. He directed a large crew that was involved in loan sharking, illegal gambling, and extortion. This crew included made members Joseph "Joey" Cigars Francolino, Joseph the Cat Lafort, Anthony Vitta, Thomas "Tommy" Sparrow Spinelli, Louis Astuto, Nunzio Squillante, Philip Mazzara, and Angelo Paccione. His closest confidant, an associate he met in grammar school as a child, Bill "Willie the Fox" Martoscia, could often be found at Jimmy's side. Fiala and others in power both recognized and respected Martoscia for his negotiating prowess in facilitating the large majority of the family's legitimate waste hauling contracts. It was no secret that New York City's garbage hauling and long-haul trucking was an industry largely under the power and control of Jimmy Brown, and as such, Martoscia managed both the insurance underwriting and claims adjusting of the family's garbage hauling and long-haul trucking accounts. When in New York, Fiala and Martoscia could be found together at the Veterans and Friends Social Club on 86th Street and 14th Avenue in Bensonhurst. During the winter months, he and Martoscia, along with their wives and children, stayed at the beachfront Diplomat Resort near Fort Lauderdale in South Florida. James and his associates are notoriously known to be heavily discreet, often avoided being seen with certain individuals in public, and frequently utilized his infamous walk and talk method to avoid surveillance while discussing legitimate and lawful business dealings. While he was feared by many, as his reputation was of a fierce and vicious operator and handler of his trade, he did in fact conduct the majority of his business in a lawful manner, which for many years saved him from tangling with the criminal judicial system. Jimmy avoided incarceration for many years due to his unique manner of conducting himself and his business. He is acknowledged and distinguished as one of the all-time top earners for the Gambino family. Nevertheless, after many years of unsuccessful efforts by the FBI to indict Jimmy Brown, he was eventually incarcerated and then soon after passed, while serving a sentence in prison for conspiracy to commit murder, a conviction the district attorney's office obtained with much help from mobster-turned-informant Sammy the Bull Gravano. For 30 years, he controlled the Trade Waste Association of Greater New York, an association of trash haulers in the New York area. Jimmy skimmed off 50% of the association dues for the Gambino family. Fiala allocated hauling routes and set pricing. Companies were prohibited from switching trash hauling companies or using non-union drivers. To prevent competitors from entering the New York City market, Fiala used threats and intimidation. In 1993, the Houston-based Browning Ferris Industries, BFI, a national trash hauling corporation, started doing business in New York. In February of that year, a company executive found a dog's severed head on his doorstep in Rockland County, New York. The following note had been placed in the dog's mouth: "Welcome to New York." Due to this mob control, New York businesses paid twice as much in trash fees as comparable businesses in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Boston. Coupled with Fiala's control of Teamsters Union Local 813, the union local for trash haul drivers, he was able to extort hundreds of millions of dollars from New York businesses. John Gotti, after taking control of the Gambino family, was recorded on federal surveillance, saying, "Jimmy Brown, he took the garbage industry and turned it into a candy store." In 1976, Gambino died, and Fiala became the acting boss of the Gambino family. However, Gambino's successor was Paul Castellano. He built a strong relationship with Castellano, meeting him weekly at Castellano's Tot Hill mansion on Staten Island. On December 16, 1985, Fiala was waiting for Castellano at the Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan to discuss family matters. When Castellano arrived outside the restaurant, gunmen allied with Gambino capo John Gotti assassinated him on the street. Soon after Castellano's death, Gotti became the new boss. Despite his ties with Castellano, Gotti left Fiala in charge of the lucrative trash hauling rackets. Over time, he built a close partnership with the Genovese crime family. It was rumored that the Genovese leadership wanted to install him as Gambino boss after a failed assassination attempt on then Gambino boss John Gotti. In 1986, as a result of the tapings at Castellano's house in 1983, Jimmy was indicted on racketeering charges. However, in June 1987, he was acquitted on federal racketeering charges. The reason cited for the acquittal was his lack of conversation on those tapings. In 1989, he participated in the murder of Gambino mobster Thomas Spinelli. A member of Jimmy's crew, Spinelli had recently testified before a grand jury and was due to appear again. Gambino underboss Sammy Gravano ordered Spinelli's murder to prevent him from providing further testimony. Spinelli was murdered inside a Brooklyn factory. In December 1990, when Gotti went to jail awaiting trial, he appointed Jimmy Brown as acting boss of the family. After Gotti's incarceration, Jimmy and Peter Gotti both jointly held the acting street boss position until Peter took over control completely. Gravano became a government witness and implicated him in the 1989 Spinelli murder. In April 1993, he was charged with racketeering and murdering Spinelli. In 1994, in a plea bargain deal, he pleaded guilty to one count of conspiracy to commit murder. During the sentencing phase, Jimmy appeared in court on crutches, and his lawyer pleaded for leniency based on his client's heart problems and hypertension. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He died of natural causes in a federal prison in Texas in August of 1999.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell, so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
In the mid-1990s, Trucchio was promoted to captain and given control over the Ozone Park Boys, a Gambino crew in Queens. Trucchio reportedly drove around Ozone Park looking for recruits for his crew. He drove a silver Cadillac, wore $5,000 suits, and displayed thick rolls of bills. One police investigator compared Trucchio to Fagin, the 19th century London gang leader in the Charles Dickens novel Oliver Twist. The Ozone Park Boys specialized in gambling, loan sharking, bookmaking, fraud, and wire fraud. Trucchio and Alphonse ran an illegal gambling operation that grossed approximately $30 million a year, with bettors who placed wagers as large as $15,000 on football and basketball games. Trucchio also owned a restaurant in Ozone Park that allegedly earned him $6.5 million, but was forfeited by the Queens District Attorney due to charges of tax evasion and tax fraud. Also involved in criminal activities in South Florida, Trucchio's crew was frequently called the Young Guns and the Liberty Posse. In October 1995, he was allegedly involved in the shooting murders of 3 people in Florida. Gambino associate Mark Rizzuto was found dead in Boca Raton. Gambino associate and strip club bouncer Vincent D'Angola, along with D'Angola's dancer girlfriend Jamie Schneider, were discovered dead in D'Angola's Fort Lauderdale apartment. The Gambino family suspected the 2 men of skimming family profits and sent other Florida crew members to murder them. Schneider may have been an innocent bystander. By 1997, Trucchio was reportedly concerned about the number of violent acts being committed by crew members in Florida and directed Gambino soldier Michael Sciaccio to watch them. Years later, Sciaccio would testify against Trucchio in Trucchio's 2003 racketeering trial. On December 9, 2002, Trucchio was indicted in New York State Court on enterprise corruption, conspiracy, promoting gambling, and possession of gambling records. The indictment stated that Trucchio conspired to engage in racketeering, murder, robbery, arson, extortion, kidnapping, drug trafficking, tampering with witnesses, retaliating against witnesses, credit card fraud, intrastate travel in aid of racketeering activity, interference with commerce by threats and violence, interstate transportation of stolen property, and thefts from interstate shipments. On April 14, 2003, Trucchio pleaded guilty to lesser charges. On October 29, 2003, Trucchio was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison. On December 4, 2003, Trucchio and other family members were indicted in federal court in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for the 1995 Florida murders, 2 armed robberies in New York, and the 2003 Bosshart murder in New York. On January 9, 2004, Trucchio pleaded not guilty in court to all the charges. In August 2005, he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison on racketeering conspiracy charges. In October 2006, Trucchio and other Florida crew members went on trial in Tampa, Florida, on new federal racketeering and extortion charges. He was accused of using intimidation to gain control of valet parking services for hospitals, restaurants, and adult entertainment clubs in the Tampa Bay area. In December 2006, Trucchio was convicted and in March 2007 was sentenced to life in prison. As of December 2011, Ronald Trucchio is serving a life sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Rampino earned the nickname Tony Roach, or simply Roach, because of his supposed physical resemblance to the cockroach. The name assumed a double meaning afterward when Rampino started smoking copious amounts of marijuana. He was involved in drug trafficking. He became a close friend of John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, Nicholas Carrozzo, and Leonard Di Maria. He was a cadaverous-looking man with huge hands and long arms that seemed to reach down past his knees, and an odd, rubbery-looking face. He liked to contort his face into all kinds of horrible grimaces in front of a mirror. Years of practice allowed him, at a second's notice, to shape his face into something like the Phantom of the Opera. He firmly believed that such faces would frighten any enemy. Rampino's passions were stickball and being a successful thief. Rampino had been troubled with a severe heroin addiction in the 1960s, which was well known among his criminal associates, but had successfully kicked the drug habit by 1979. Former friend Sammy Gravano later said, "It was all around amongst us that people with John were heavy in drugs. Personally, I don't believe John ever did it himself. But he had to know what was going on. I mean, there's Gene Gotti, his own brother, Angelo Ruggiero, who he grew up with, the other guys with him, John Carneglia, Edward Lino, Tony Roach, Anthony Rampino, who not only had a reputation for drugs, but was an ex-junkie. Rampino and Wilfred Johnson served as John Gotti's chief loan collectors for the crew. Rampino was an associate of the Gambino crime family, affiliated with John Gotti's crew, which was headquartered out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, but never became a fully initiated or made member of the organization. John Marzulli of the New York Daily News described Rampino as a colorful mob character who was notable for his skull-like appearance. Another unnamed source called him the scariest man you'd ever meet, tall, lean, and he looked like a vampire. Rampino was a backup shooter in the assassination of Gambino crime family boss Paul Castellano and his underboss Tommy Bellotti, who were each shot dead by a team of hitmen outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan on December 16, 1985. According to a source, Rampino's job was to kill anyone, civilians or cops, who followed the hit team. The murder of Castellano allowed for Gotti's rise to boss of the Gambino crime family. On June 28, 1987, Rampino was arrested for selling $30,000 worth of heroin to an undercover police officer in Ozone Park, Queens. He was sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison for the criminal sale of a controlled substance in the first degree, which carries a sentence of 15 years to life in prison. His bail was set at $150,000. Arnold Squitieri was a former acting boss and underboss of the Gambino crime family. He is also known as Zeke, Bozy, and Squitty. On August 18, 1970, Squitieri shot garment cutter Desiderio Caban 5 times on a street in East Harlem. 2 NYPD officers heard the shots and chased Squitieri by car for 6 blocks until he finally stopped. Getting out of his car, Squitieri approached the officers and told them, "Don't worry about it. He's only shot in the arm. Let me go. The boys will take care of you." A week later, mobster Alphonse Siska met with one of the officers and offered a $5,000 bribe to the policeman. They accepted the deal and removed Squitieri's name from the crime report for the Caban killing. Later on, after the bribery was discovered, the officers were indicted and Squitieri became a fugitive from justice. In January 1972, Squitieri surrendered to authorities. While awaiting trial for the Caban murder in '73, Squitty and his wife Marie were charged with failing to file U.S. federal income tax returns for 3 years. The couple had concealed $200,000 in income in bank accounts under false names. For the tax charges, he would serve 4 years in prison. On March 14, 1973, Squitieri pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter in the 1970 Caban murder. Squitieri was later sentenced to 8 years in state prison. He was released from prison in May of 1981 and soon began selling narcotics for the Gotti crew in New Jersey. In 1982, he was being supplied with heroin by Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti. In 1986, after John Gotti replaced Paul Castellano as Gambino boss, Squitieri was inducted into the family. In 1988, he was convicted in Camden, New Jersey, of conspiring to distribute heroin and was sentenced to more than 11 years in prison. After his release, in 1999, boss John Gotti promoted him to underboss, and after the arrest of Gambino, acting boss Peter Gotti, Squitieri would become the new acting boss for the Gambino crime family. While on parole from prison, he received a flat-panel television as a gift from undercover FBI agent Joaquin Jack Garcia. One evening, Squitieri was watching the TV series about the mafia called The Sopranos. On the show, family boss Anthony Soprano wants to have a troublesome family member returned to prison. To do this, he sends the mobster a stolen TV set. Soprano then arranges for a parole officer to visit the man and arrest him for possessing stolen property. When the show was over, a frightened Squitieri gave away the TV and purchased his own. During the early and mid-2000s, he had to contend with ethnic Albanian gangs' involvement with the gambling rackets in Queens. One particular threat was with the Rudaj organization, or the corporation, run by mobster Alex Rudaj. At first, Gregory De Palma was able to solve minor disputes, but the corporation became less cooperative over time. In September 2005, Arnold arranged a meeting with Rudaj at a gas station in New Jersey. When the corporation mobsters arrived, 20 armed Gambino men confronted them. FBI undercover agent known as Jack Falcone stated in his book that Squitieri told the corporation mobsters, "You took what you took, and that's it, or there's going to be a problem." The Gambinos outnumbered the corporation 20-6. Rudaj ordered one of his men to shoot a gas tank if a gunfight ensued. Rudaj eventually listened to advice and stopped interfering with Gambino operations. On March 9, 2005, he was arrested on charges of extorting money from construction companies in Westchester County, New York, Mineola, New York, and New Jersey. On June 15th, a tearful Squiti pleaded guilty to conducting an illegal gambling operation and to tax evasion. He was sentenced to just over 7 years in federal prison in June of 2006. He was incarcerated at the Devens Federal Medical Center in Massachusetts. Arnold was released on December 7, 2012, and lived a long life thereafter. He recently died on January 27, 2022, at the age of 85.
If you haven't already, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to click on the notification bell, so you'll be up to date on all videos released from the Everything Network.
Giovanni John Gambino became a made member of the Gambino crime family in or around 1975, and also was made a captain, in addition to being head of the crime family's Sicilian faction, appointed by family boss John Gotti in 1986, according to Sammy the Bull. Together with his younger brothers Rosario, Sal, and Giuseppe, Joseph, he formed a faction in the crime family known as the Cherry Hill Gambinos, for their base of operation in the New Jersey town that holds the same name. Although they were distant cousins of former family boss Carlo Gambino, they did not owe him allegiance. They were Sicilian mafiosi, men from Palermo, whose father had brought the family to New York in 1964. The Gambino brothers ran the Cafe Valentino on 18th Avenue in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. The Gambinos hailed from the Paso di Regano neighborhood in Palermo, just as the Inzerillo clan, headed by Salvatore Inzerillo. Together, the Inzerillo-Gambino mafia clan formed a transatlantic mafia family, based in Palermo and New York. The Inzerillo clan had been on the verge of total extermination by Totò Riina and the Corleonesi during the Second Mafia War in Sicily, when in 1981, the family boss Salvatore Inzerillo was killed. With the intervention of the Gambino crime family in New York, a deal was worked out that allowed the surviving Inzerillos to take refuge in the US, with the agreement that none of them, or their offspring, could ever return to Sicily. Many went to the New York area and joined forces with the Gambino family. They were dubbed the escapees. Despite a ban on drug dealing, the Gambino faction were heavily involved in international heroin trafficking out of Bensonhurst. John was the converging point in the United States for a consortium of heroin traffickers of the Sicilian mafia, composed of the Inzerillo family and Stefano Bontade, and the final destination for its shipments of heroin that was refined in laboratories in Sicily from Turkish morphine base. His relative Giovanni Falcone, the investigating magistrate who was assigned the heroin trafficking case in 1980, estimated that by the late 1970s, the Inzerillo Gambino Spatola network was smuggling $600 million worth of heroin into the US each year, with a multitude of interests and heavy capital investments. Gambino had close relationship with the Italian banker Michele Sindona. They dined often and openly at the luxurious Hotel Pierre on Fifth Avenue, or the Gambino's Café Valentino. Gambino was a frequent guest at New York dinner parties in Sindona's honor. When Sindona got in trouble and was indicted for the bankruptcy of the Franklin National Bank, John procured a false passport and helped to stage a bogus kidnap in August 1979 to conceal a mysterious 11-week trip to Sicily before his scheduled fraud trial. However, Sindona also had put the mafia's heroin money at risk due to his financial malpractice. The real purpose of the kidnapping was to issue sparsely disguised blackmail notes to Sindona's past political allies, among them Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, to engineer the rescue of his banks and recuperate Cosa Nostra's money. Gambino accompanied Sindona's attempt to recover the money, but the plans failed and Sindona was arrested, leading to the indictment of the Inzerillo Spatola Gambino network. It remains unclear if any of the mafia money Sindona had lost was recovered. Indicted in 1980 in relation with the heroin trafficking network, he was convicted and sentenced to 6.5 years for heroin trafficking in Palermo. The sentence in absentia was confirmed by Italy's Supreme Court in 1985. However, Gambino remained free because the US did not agree with Italian requests for extradition. John and Joe Gambino were acquitted in a 1984 New Jersey drug case in which their brother, Rosario, was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in prison. On December 1, 1988, Italian and US law enforcement cracked down on the Gambino Inzerillo network again with Operation Iron Tower. Italian and federal prosecutors indicted some 200 defendants in Italy and the US on drug trafficking charges. Among the arrestees was Joe Gambino, the owner of Café Giardino. A crowd of about 100 had gathered at the cafe to hear a newly arrived Italian singer. Federal agents moved in as the entertainment ended, with one agent coming to the mic and saying, in effect, "This is your last dance." Some of the partygoers thought it was a joke and laughed, while a few tried to run but were caught. John Gambino wasn't charged. The FBI couldn't gather enough evidence against him, but was described in the court affidavit as the current leader of the Brooklyn-based Sicilian faction of the Gambino family. The brothers were released after initial indictments in 1988 and 1989. John Gambino was arrested on January 4, 1990. He later was charged in a superseding indictment with narcotics and racketeering violations. On January 5, 1990, he was released on a $2 million personal recognizance bond signed by his wife, Vittoria Gambino, and his son, Tommy Gambino. Due to testimonies of mafia turncoats such as Sammy Gravano of the New York Gambino crime family and Francesco Marino Mannoia, an Italian pentito who had become a government witness, Joe and John Gambino and 6 other defendants, including Francesco Inzerillo, were indicted on charges that they smuggled and distributed drugs, operated a number of organized crime enterprises, and took part in the 1988 murder of Francesco Oliveri. However, the brothers failed to appear at their arraignment on September 1, 1992, at the Federal District Court in Manhattan, forfeiting $5 million bail. Electronic monitoring bracelets, intended to keep track of them, had been removed with the approval of the government in July that year. On September 17, 1992, John and Joe Gambino were arrested in a secluded motel suite in Fort Lauderdale, South Florida, where they were said to have associates who would help them flee to Venezuela, where they owned an interest in a ranch. They were returned to Manhattan for trial. In February 1993, the trial against John and Joe Gambino and their associates Lenzo Mannino and Matteo Romano started. The prosecution portrayed them as the main distributors of heroin smuggled from Italy and South America to Miami and New York by the Sicilian mafia, while the defense countered that the central drug and murder charges in the case were based on the uncorroborated testimony of Marino Manoia and Gravano, whom the defense depicted as killers and liars. The trial ended in mistrial in June 1993, when a jury was unable to reach a verdict on charges of racketeering, drug trafficking, and murder. Marino Manoia was admitted into the Witness Protection Program in the United States. Italy had no such program at the time. He testified he had met with John Gambino personally, who had inspected the quality of the heroin Marino Manoia was refining in Palermo. His testimony finally induced the Gambinos to plead guilty to drug trafficking in an arrangement with prosecution. In June 1994, after prosecutors recommended 15-year sentences without parole, the men agreed to plead guilty to the racketeering charges stemming from activity that took place from 1975 to 1992. The pentito, Gaspare Mutolo, revealed that he organized a 400-kilogram shipment of heroin to the US in 1981. The Contrera Caruana Mafia clan received half of the load, while John Gambino took possession of the other 200 kilograms. The shipments were financed by a consortium of Sicilian mafia clans, who had organized a pool to provide the money to buy the merchandise from Thai suppliers. In prison, Gambino survived a stroke, heart attacks, and open-heart surgery. Sitting in a wheelchair, he was released in October 2005, but was later arrested to face an extradition request by Italy. He was released on bail. In September 2006, he was freed when a federal judge overruled a decision that would have extradited him to Italy to face drug charges. The judge ruled that Gambino had already served a 15-year sentence in the US for drug trafficking and murder, and could not be tried again for the same charges in Italy. According to court papers filed in Brooklyn Federal Court, John Gambino was one of a three-man panel that ran the Gambino family, jointly with Daniel Marino and Bartolomeo Bobby Vernacci, after Operation Old Bridge in February 2008 decapitated the leadership. They oversaw a slimmed-down criminal gang of 200 made men active in drug trafficking, extortion, and loan sharking, according to the FBI. He was a high-ranking member of the family along with his wife's nephew, Frank Cali. On November 16, 2017, Gambino died of natural causes in New York. Rosario Gambino is a son of Tommaso Gambino, born in Palermo in Sicily on January 12, 1942. Along with his two brothers Giuseppe, Joseph, and Giovanni, John, he became a made man of the Sicilian mafia. They are distant relatives of Carlo Gambino and his son Thomas Gambino. The family moved to the United States in 1962. After moving, Gambino started his own family and had 4 children. Both of his sons, Anthony and Tommaso, have been suspected of. After Rosario's imprisonment in Los Angeles, his children moved to Los Angeles and ran a record company and a payphone installation company. The Gambinos also were closely related to the Spatola, Inzerillo, and DiMaggio mafia families in Sicily. All these families worked closely together to form a transatlantic heroin smuggling operation. The Gambino family eventually made their way to New Jersey. Although they entered the country illegally in 1962, they were granted permanent residency in 1966. The brothers later joined the Gambino crime family and were made members of the criminal organization in 1975 by Paul Castellano, who is also a distant relative. Older brother Giovanni, who Americanized his name to John, was named a captain in the crime family, and Rosario and Giuseppe, who Americanized his name to Joseph, were his top lieutenants. Together, the brothers formed a crew known as the Cherry Hill Gambinos, named after their city of operation, Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Together, Rosario and Joseph ran a chain of restaurants called Father and Son Pizza. They also ran pizza shops in Philadelphia and Camden, and with a cousin, pizzerias as far south as Dover, Delaware. The two brothers were also suspects in a string of arsons in the 1980s. Despite his considerable earnings, Rosario reported little money on his income tax return. Rosario Gambino owned Sul's Pizza in Delran, New Jersey. Although no longer there, it's where he met with his underlings now and again, wearing suits that made him a standalone presence. According to government reports, one finds a financial picture which is simply not credible. His own attorney was unable to identify his occupation when asked to do so by the court. During the last few years, he has reported moderate amounts of income, approximately $20,000 in his 1982 U.S. individual income tax return and approximately $21,000 in his 1983. Yet he lives in a lavish home, which is insured for $150,000 and for which he makes mortgage payments of over $1,000 each month. Moreover, during the calendar year 1983, he made deposits totaling just under $35,000 in his checking account. He testified that he was unemployed from December 31, 1983, until his arrest on March 16, 1984. Although he allegedly had no source of income, he stated he left untouched the $20,000 in cash he had accumulated from his pizzeria. Still, he was able to meet his living expenses, gamble in the casinos, and pay $1,700 in cash to have fountain lights installed in front of his house during this time period. In 1983, Luis Eppolito, a former New York Police Department (NYPD) detective who worked on behalf of the New York mafia, was suspected in a corruption case that he had provided NYPD intelligence reports onto Rosario. Rosario was also linked to the Pizza Connection probe, where dealers would sell drugs from pizzerias. Despite an official ban on drug dealing by the American mafia, the Italian Gambino brothers were heavily involved in international heroin trafficking out of Bensonhurst. The Cherry Hill Gambinos were the ultimate recipients of the heroin that was brought in by the Inzerillo Gambino Spatola di Maggio clan from Sicily. They smuggled an estimated $600 million worth of heroin into the US every year. A lot of this money was sent back to Italy to be invested in legitimate businesses. By 1982, the Inzerillo Gambino Spatola holdings in Palermo alone were estimated to be worth $1 billion. The Gambinos had a close relationship. In March 1980, Rosario and his brother Joseph were arrested by American authorities for alleged participation in an attempt to import 91 pounds of heroin from Milan, Italy. They were both acquitted of those charges. In 1984, Gambino and 3 others went on trial for narcotics trafficking charges in the United States. Gambino was found guilty of selling heroin to undercover police officers and sentenced to 45 years in prison. He was then sent to Federal Correctional Institution, Terminal Island in Los Angeles, to serve his sentence. Rosario Gambino made headlines again in 2001 when reports surfaced that in 1995, President Bill Clinton's half-brother, Roger Clinton Jr., had allegedly accepted $50,000 and a Rolex watch from Gambino's children. According to reports, in return, Roger said he could guarantee Anna and Tommaso, Rosario's children, a presidential pardon by President Clinton. In 1995, Clinton unsuccessfully lobbied officials for parole for Rosario Gambino. In 1999, when the president was prepared to decide who would be pardoned before his final days in office, Gambino's name was on the list for consideration. Ultimately, the president did not grant Gambino a pardon. While in prison, Gambino remained in good contact with the Los Angeles crime family members Jimmy Cassi and his own son Tommaso. The Italian government attempted to extradite Gambino in 2001, based on an in absentia conviction for drug trafficking. The U.S. District Court in California denied the request because Gambino had already been convicted on similar charges in New York. In 2006, Gambino was released from prison after serving 22 years and then transferred to an immigrant detention center in California to await expulsion to Italy. Citation needed. In September of 2007, an immigration judge in Los Angeles cited the United Nations Convention Against Torture in ruling that Gambino should not be deported. The judge found that in Italy, Gambino would probably be locked up in a harsh, life-threatening and life-shortening prison system designed to compel inmates to reveal information about the Sicilian mafia. Similar reasoning was used to prevent his brothers from being deported after their criminal convictions. Immigration and Customs Enforcement successfully appealed the ruling. On May 23, 2009, Gambino arrived at Rome's Leonardo da Vinci Fiumicino Airport, where he was taken into custody. He was released while his lawyer, Daniele Francesco Lelli, pursued an appeal with the Court of Cassation, Italy's top criminal court. However, shortly after his release from prison, the Palermo Appeals Court issued an arrest warrant for Gambino on October 27, 2011. He was arrested in a Rome clinic where he had checked in for medical tests. Gambino appealed the conviction, and on February 3, 2014, he was acquitted of drug trafficking charges and was freed from prison. You're watching the Everything Network. Alfonso, the peacemaker Attardi, the first confirmed Gambino crime family informant. Attardi was born in Sicily in 1897 and allegedly joined the Sicilian mafia before immigrating to New York in 1919. He became a bootlegger and joined the D'Aquila gang during the 1920s, later evolved into the Gambino crime family. It is noted that Attardi was heavily involved in the narcotic trade from the 1930s to late 1940s. By 1947, he was an informant for the FBN, and by 1952, Attardi was informing on the American mafia. He disappeared shortly thereafter. Attardi gave an interview to columnist Jack Anderson in 1968. Depending on the sources, he died in 1970 or 1972 in Suffolk County, New York. Alfredo Freddy the Sige Sant'Antonio. He was initiated into the Gambino family in 1953. Sant'Antonio was reportedly very close to Albert Anastasia, and he was also the brother-in-law of Jack Parisi, a Gambino soldier and former Murder, Inc. gunman. It is believed Sant'Antonio became an informant in 1961. In 1962, he avoided a prison sentence for attempting to sell stolen bonds with two other criminals. On July 11, 1963, he was shot 5 times and killed by 2 men whilst inside of a Brooklyn florist shop. Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, former associate and confidant of John Gotti. He could never become a member of the Gambino family due to his Native American heritage, for which he was named Wahoo. Johnson became an informer in 1966 for the FBI due to apparent dissatisfaction with the mob. During a public hearing in 1985, federal prosecutor Diane Giacalone revealed that Johnson was cooperating with law enforcement. Johnson immediately refused to enter the witness protection program and was subsequently murdered on August 29, 1988. Bonanno crime family hitmen Vincent Giattino and Thomas Patera murdered Johnson as a favor for Gotti. Johnson was reportedly shot 19 times and found face down in a pool of his own blood. Dominic Montiglio, former associate, who testified in 1983. He attended the wake of Gambino underboss Frank Scalise in 1957 with his uncle and future Gambino captain Nino Gaggi. In 1973, he met Roy DeMeo, then an associate in the Gambino family, and Chris Rosenberg. He served as an errand boy for his uncle, which required him to collect payments from the DeMeo crew. DeMeo had offered him the opportunity of selling narcotics, however Nino ordered Montiglio not to get involved. Montiglio was involved in the April 1975 attempted murder of Vincent Governara. He fled to California in 1979 after believing Roy DeMeo and his uncle Nino Gaggi were planning to murder him after Gambino boss Paul Castellano heard gossip of Montiglio selling and using heroin. His testimony in 1983 led Nino to be sentenced to 5 years in prison, where he would die in 1988. His testimony has brought down at least 60 American mafia mobsters, with a confirmed number of 56 people. James Cardinale, born in 1950. He is a former Gambino crime family associate who testified against John Gotti in December 1986. In 1975, he was given a 4-year sentence for possession of weapons and drugs. Cardinale first met Gotti at the Clinton Correctional Facility in the late 1970s, before he was transferred to Attica and Gotti to Green Haven. Cardinale was released from the program in July 1989 by confiding his identity. He admitted to participating in 5 murders. You're watching the Everything Network. Dominic Big Dom Lafaro, former associate. In 1983 or 1984, depending on the source, Lafaro attempted to sell a kilogram of heroin to undercover FBI and DEA agents. He shortly became an informer after his arrest due to the fact that he faced over 20 years in prison. In 1986, he was one out of 3 American mafia informers to testify against Gambino boss John Gotti, alongside James Cardinale and Colombo crime family associate Salvatore Polisi. Lafaro received probation for his testimony against Gotti. On the 7th of January 1987, he admitted to fabricating stories in order to make a deal with the government. He later admitted to murdering Salvatore Calabria at his home in 1982 and served as an accomplice in the murder of Calabria's wife in 1983. Also during January 1987, he pled guilty to attempted murder, illegal gambling, and loan sharking. He died in 2003. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, the first underboss to break his blood oath. Gravano admitted to the killings of 19 people and cooperated with the government in 1991. He also admitted to fixing John Gotti's trials, which led Gotti to be called the Teflon Don due to his evasion from prosecution. He was released from prison in 1994 and immediately entered the witness protection program, which allowed him to flee to Arizona under protection. The plan consisted of murdering Gravano with a landmine or shooting him with a hunting rifle. After his 2002 drug-related arrest, the assigned Gambino hitmen, Thomas Huck Carbonaro and Eddie Garofalo, planned to send a nail bomb into his prison cell via mail. Gravano was released from prison in 2017. Dominic Fat Dom Borghese, former soldier. He served in the crew of Jackie D'Amico and later John A. Gotti. Borghese was very close with John A. Gotti. He even attended his wedding in 1990 and were partners together in several lucrative Staten Island illegal bookmaking operations. He later testified against him in 1998. Borghese admitted to helping dispose of 2 murdered bodies. However, he was unable to dig underneath due to the fact that he weighed over 400 pounds. He entered the Witness Protection Program in 1995. He testified against high-ranking Gambino associate Joe Watts. Louis Casman, former associate. He was close to the Gotti family. John Gotti considered Casman as a son. He cooperated in 2005. In 2015, he was arrested on felony grand theft and fraud charges in Florida. Casman reportedly lived in a $900,000 mansion on Delray Beach. Robert Mormando, former soldier and hitman for the Gambino crime family. In October 2009, Mormando became the first mobster to admit in open court that he is gay. He was involved in the 2003 shooting of a Queens bagel store owner. Nicholas "Nicky Skins" Stefanelli, former soldier who was active in New Jersey, he was a member of Nicholas Carozzo's crew. He became an informant in 2010. Stefanelli reportedly murdered an informant in February 2011, Joseph Rossi, who he blamed for forcing him into becoming an informer. He committed suicide 2 days after he murdered Rossi. He was found dead in a hotel room. Giovanni "Johnny" Monteleone, former associate who turned informer in 2013. Sopranos actor Tony Darrow asked Monteleone and Gambino soldier Joseph Orlando to recover money from a debt owed to him. Facing extortion charges, it was revealed in 2013 that Monteleone had cooperated. He received no prison time. John Elite, former associate who testified against John A. Gotti and hitman Charles Carneglia. Elite pleaded guilty to 2 murders, 4 murder conspiracies, at least 8 shootings and 2 attempted shootings, as well as armed home invasions and armed robberies in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Florida. His testimony against Carneglia resulted in the defendant receiving a life sentence after being found guilty of 4 murders. On April 26, 2011, Elite was sentenced to 10 years in prison, however was released in January 2012. Craig De Palma, son of deceased Gambino acting captain Gregory De Palma. De Palma was a soldier and was proposed for membership by John Gotti. He later served in the crew of John A. Gotti. He cooperated in 2000 and died in December 2010 from 8 years spent in a coma after a failed jailhouse suicide in 2002. Michael "Mickey Scars" DeLeonardo, former Gambino capo. DeLeonardo was active since the 1960s. His brother was shot to death in 1981 in a dispute related with the Gambino and Colombo crime families. DeLeonardo was denied permission to avenge the murder by boss Paul Castellano. He was inducted into the Gambino crime family alongside John A. Gotti on December 24, 1988. In 1989, he helped arrange the murder of publisher and sanitation business owner Fred Weiss, who was shot to death by the New Jersey DeCavalcanti crime family as a favor to John J. Gotti. He admitted to corruption, bribery, and the extortion of construction companies based in Manhattan and Brooklyn with the Genovese crime family. During one incident, Anthony Graziano, the consigliere of the Bonanno crime family, managed to obtain the kickback for a $22 million building contract at MDC Brooklyn, which the Gambino family also rivaled for. Primo Casarino, former soldier, and was part of Anthony Siccone's crew. He became a government witness shortly after his June 2002 arrest. He was accused of labor racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, witness tampering, and the murder of Fred Weiss. He later testified against former Gambino boss Peter Gotti, Captain Louis Valario, hitman Michael Iannotti, Richard G. Gotti, and the brother of John Gotti, Richard V. Gotti. His testimony has secured the convictions of more than 80 American mafia members and associates. Frankie Fapiano, former soldier. He allegedly became a Gambino soldier during the early 1990s and decided to cooperate in two. Fapiano has a brother in the Colombo crime family. He was convicted of racketeering and extortion in 2003, alongside former boss Peter Gotti and several other Gambino members. In 2004, he was additionally convicted of racketeering, money laundering, and for the extortion of action film star Steven Seagal. Casarino became a government witness in 2005 after he was sentenced to over 11 years in prison. In 2005, he confessed about the infiltration of the International Longshoremen's Association. He testified in the trial of Genovese capo Lawrence Ritchie in November 2005, who was later murdered a few weeks after, and also testified against Gambino soldier Anthony Todo Anastasio